Hi, my name's Tom Davison. I'm talking to you here from Lookout Mobile Security. I'm the technical director here in EMEA. It's great to be with you today, having the chance to talk to you all. What I'm going to focus on during this session is the situation we find ourselves under the pandemic, which has really been a massive acceleration of remote working. I'm sure, like me, you're probably finding that your organizations are putting much more focus on remote working out of necessity. So I'm going to talk about some of the things that have happened, some of the challenges. I'm going to focus on some of the threats, very specifically to mobile. And then we'll talk a bit about some of the guidance you can take to move forward in a more secure way in your organizations. So let's start off. Let's focus on the story, at least as it was for me here at Lookout. So this is a copy and paste from an email I received personally, along with everyone else in the company, from our CEO. This came out, as you can see, on the 15th of March. So it seems like a very long time ago now, but if you cast your minds back, this was right at the beginning. At least here in the UK, this was before we went into a lockdown situation. But we decided as a company that we were going to ask everybody for the safety and to reduce the chance of infection, we were going to ask everybody to work from home for a couple of weeks. Now, nobody predicted things would be as they were, and here we are probably 6 months later now, and I'm still working at home. We're maybe starting to go back to the office gradually, but it's very likely that we'll be in this same situation for many months to come. And it's very unlikely that we'll ever go back to spending as much time in the office as we did before. We're in, as we discussed, a new normal and a new way of working. And so if your organization was like Lookout, you would have been in the same situation where things almost changed overnight. So you probably already had mobile working. You probably already had a proportion of your employees who could work flexibly, but very unlikely that the whole company was able to do that. So we were put in a situation where almost overnight, everything changed, everything flipped on its head. And what did that mean? Well, it meant initially we had to worry about business continuity. It was important that we all keep our businesses moving and people were still able to interact and serve customers and so on. So the big push was on continuity. Most likely that meant that you had to rapidly enable people's own devices. Most organizations don't give every user a device. So you probably had to allow people to work from their home desktops, laptops, iPads, tablets, phones, whatever it might be. So really what happened was a massive acceleration almost overnight of a BYOD program. And normally in any company, you wouldn't take that step immediately. You would build to this gradually, you would plan it, you would schedule it. But we didn't have that luxury. So of course that meant things happened quickly, and we didn't necessarily do it in the way we would want to do it. Because what we effectively did by enabling all these devices is we expanded our attack surface. We suddenly brought on many more devices accessing corporate data that probably weren't under the management of your company. You probably don't have visibility on what happens on those devices. A good example would be, do you know what OS level everything is running? Can you force it to be patched? If it's a personal device, do you know what other applications are running on there that might pose a risk to the company? And do your mobile endpoint detection and response tools play into that field? So if you have an endpoint detection and response strategy, does it cover all of the mobile devices as well as the desktops? These are all considerations. And really, this is where we find ourselves now, both literally and figuratively. We've lost our security perimeter. So we're not in physical offices anymore behind closed walls. More of our services have gone online and have to be accessible from the internet, but also from a logical perspective, you probably don't have the tools currently to consider those devices trusted. All of the people accessing your data, your employees, are probably coming from effectively untrusted devices, which, you know, it accelerates this whole idea of zero trust, but it means you have to have a different mindset and potentially deploy some different tools in your organization to feel secure and meet regulatory requirements and so on. A few observations from McKinsey and Company. This comes from an article that you can see linked in the slides. This was something that they released to give guidance to CIOs and CISOs. And they're really calling out three different things here, which are things you have to consider. So the first one is how people are accessing data. More of your services will have shifted to the cloud and would have shifted online. That may have changed how people authenticate. It may have changed your levels of access control and so on. Particularly on a mobile platform, someone may shift from using a desktop with a browser to access services to using the native app of that company. And so you need to start thinking about conditional access in there, whether you just allow someone to log in with a username and password, or whether there's MFA, whether there's a factor as well to consider the health of the device. So these are all considerations. The other one is when you look at devices, you're almost certainly allowing people to use personal devices now. And that has some big ramifications from a privacy perspective. So how much you can actually monitor someone's device if it's a personal device, but also you need to understand the dangers that can come from all of the other things they do on that device. So they'll probably be moving quite fluidly from work-related tasks to personal tasks and so on. And then the third one is lack of social control. So being in a home environment, like I said, people moving between work and personal, probably on a device where they're getting corporate email, but also personal WhatsApp messages or Facebook Messenger. It becomes much, much more simple for someone to fall for a phishing attack. And we saw under COVID-19, we saw in Q1 actually a 37% increase in phishing attacks purely because of COVID-19, numbers of attacks referencing COVID-19, which I'll talk about in a minute. So phishing becomes a much bigger issue than it was previously. Now I want to talk about the types of threats specifically. So if we've got this new scenario, we've got a lot of workers out there accessing the organization, what are the kind of things you need to worry about? And when we look in a mobile context, particularly, what are the threats? Well, phishing, I've just mentioned it, but let's look at that more closely. So mobile phishing, from Lookout's perspective, we have a great visibility into the number of threats that happen on mobile devices. We have over 200 million devices using our service. So that gives us a really good idea of the kind of threats that people encounter. And by a long order of magnitude, the biggest threat that we see is phishing. And two reasons we think. One is that on a mobile device, it's much simpler, or people are more likely to fall for a phishing message. When they're on a work desktop or laptop and they're primarily interacting through email and controlled messaging services, you probably have tools in place, and they're also quite well trained to look for things out of the ordinary. When you come to a mobile device, 85% of phishing attacks don't occur through email. So they come through SMS, or they come through messaging apps. They may come through services like LinkedIn or Facebook. They may come through even games people have, which can pop up banners that people click on that can lead to malicious content and so on. So there's many ways for people to be targeted, and harder for them to spot that. The second thing is that we see on mobile, phishing is the gateway to all of the other bad things that can happen. So we've been tracking serious mobile threats and breaches for the last 5 years or so. We have a lot of information on our blog, which can be from commodity-based attacks like ransomware right through to state-sponsored targeted attacks. And you'll see in almost every case, the first stage of the attack is a phishing message, either to try and steal someone's identity, steal credentials, or to persuade them to go to that second stage, which is to install something malicious, a malicious app on the device. So there's some examples on the screen here of some of the things we saw under COVID-19, but you can rest assured that COVID was just a new message. It was just a new theme for phishing messages. But phishing messages evolve all the time. Whatever the news story is, you'll see phishing campaigns. It could be around the tax return time of year where people are concerned with their finances. It could be around health issues like this. It could be about the election. If it's election time in the US, you'll see more messages around that, for example. So lots of different ways people are targeted. And these are some fairly generic examples you see on the screen, but it can be much more dangerous in the enterprise context because attackers are now going to much greater lengths to target companies specifically. So these were two examples of phishing attacks that Lookout identified against AT&T and Verizon Mobile, two very large organizations. And these took advantage of the fact that on a mobile device, as you can see, it was very difficult to identify the real login page from the fake login page. You can see that the only difference on the Verizon example on the right really is the URL, and they look very similar. On the left, again, very, very similar. A few differences in the cosmetics, but the type of things the user's being asked to input, the user ID, the password, the multi-factor, all the same. So very, very powerful phishing campaigns. And we see more and more of this because people understand that more and more of our employees are working from mobile devices. Now, as I said, a phishing message may try and steal credentials, but it may also try and persuade you to install an application. And this is a technique we see used very often when it comes to surveillanceware and campaigns that want to have long-term agency on someone's device. One of the most powerful things you can do on a mobile device is persuade someone to install the malicious app. If you can do that, it's always on, it's always connected, it has access to potentially the sensors like your GPS, your microphone, your camera. It may even be able to access data from other applications if they're able to compromise the device integrity. So again, like with phishing, under COVID, we saw many new malware samples that were hiding behind the COVID message. So there were many apps made available to gain updates on new cases of COVID-19 close to you. There were apps that were helping you do tracking and things like that. And what we saw is that all of the malware families that we would typically see, maybe ransomware, maybe surveillanceware, they all created new instances of those applications to target people's anxiety, hunger for information, sense of urgency that came with COVID. So again, it was the same tricks, but new messaging, new themes. And we still see this as again, a very high prevalent threat. And keep in mind, this isn't just targeting your users, this can also be targeting your customers. Because one of the other changes we saw with COVID is that to succeed as a business, you had to shift a lot of your customer interactions online. So that, you know, the obvious example we all know about is Amazon. Amazon has done very, very well through this pandemic because they're an online business, with, you know, fully developed. But other businesses that relied more on physical interaction had to move to virtual interaction. And so if you have a customer facing application, it's also possible for people to target your users if it's maybe a financial application, a banking application. And we see examples of that as well. How likely are you to encounter a phishing attack? So this is some of the data that we have. As I said, we have over 200 million devices on our service. So that allows us to see how often people encounter phishing attacks. We have enterprise customers, we have personal customers. And you can see here there is a difference. Enterprise customers generally receive fewer phishing messages or click fewer phishing messages. So it could be that they're more aware when they're on a device that has access to work data. It could be that you already have some protections in place. But what is interesting for me, at least, is that the rate of encounter between Android and iOS is very similar. So if this idea that you think you may be safer on one device versus another, it doesn't really matter with phishing. That doesn't apply. Also, the other very interesting statistic here is that customers running MDM, which is mobile device management, are actually more likely to see phishing encounters. Now, this may be that their employees feel that they have some security with MDM, which is actually not true because MDM doesn't provide phishing protection, but maybe they have a sense of being already taken care of by the organization. So that's a very important statistic. If we focus on the region specifically, this map is actually available on our website. You can go to lookout.com and interact with this. And you can look at the whole global picture. You can look at different device types and so on. You'll see that the statistics here represent 2019 as a whole, and you can see that the encounter rates in the region are surprisingly high. So this is the percentage of users that have encountered a phishing link during a 12-month period. So if you don't have protection on devices, if you don't have visibility of the consequences, that will be challenging for you. So that is some of the data on the problem, the scale of the problem. What about guidance for securing your workers? How do you make sure people are able to work safely from mobile devices? Well, hopefully this is common sense, some of the things I'm going to introduce to you now, but I'll also talk about some of the tools that we have available. So firstly, it's almost certain that you have to adopt an any screen, any device policy. We've seen more organizations shift to embracing personal devices, bring your own devices in the workplace. And that means that you need to think about privacy policies. You need to think about how you can segment corporate data on the device from personal data. But if you try and limit people to work devices only, that's probably going to be quite challenging and potentially more expensive as well. So from a business continuity perspective, we would recommend that you embrace this idea of different types of device being able to access your data. When you do that though, you need some baseline requirements. One of the big risks on a mobile device, which makes it much easier for a phishing attack or a malicious app to be successful, is if you don't upgrade the operating system, if you don't apply patches. Now with mobility, that's more challenging because it's typically being controlled by the end user, by your employees. So you need to give guidance on baseline requirements, and you need ways to be able to monitor that as well and detect when those devices are not being patched and updated. You need to then also look at things like biometrics. Mobile devices have some great facilities built in to provide additional security, but you need to make sure they're being used. So it's making sure that people have passcodes set, that they don't enable settings that can be risky, like downloading apps from third-party sources and so on. So you need visibility of that. You need to identify jailbroken and rooted devices. And all of this is quite manageable when you have an MDM managing that device, but if you have people bringing in personal devices that are not being managed by the company, this is where it can be more challenging. The other area of challenge I see right now with many companies is how they can block vulnerable apps. So in 2019, WhatsApp published 2 serious vulnerabilities that were being exploited that would allow someone to attack that device through a vulnerable version of WhatsApp. So being aware of vulnerable versions of common apps and making sure they get updated is critical. The other thing from a corporate perspective is understanding what apps can do. So if you have a device running corporate apps on there, but you also have personal apps, you need to look at those capabilities. So, can the app access things like contacts? Can it access GPS on the device? Where does it send that data to? So being aware of the capability of apps and being able to blacklist, block apps is important as well. Now you can do a lot of this through policy. You need to train your users, but the other thing you should think about as well is upgrading your tool sets, making sure that you have capabilities from a technical perspective. And there's 2 things you need to consider here, 2 technologies. One of them is enterprise mobility management or unified endpoint management. So you'll see this talked about as EMM, MDM, UEM, lots of acronyms. The other one is mobile threat defense or mobile endpoint detection and response. You'll see different terminology there, but it's about having a management layer and a security layer. So enterprise mobility management will do exactly what it says. It will allow you to manage a device and check that the basic settings for security, for the most secure scenario, are enforced. The limit of mobility management is that it doesn't provide the advanced levels of security. It won't provide protection against phishing attacks. It won't give you insights into app capabilities or block malicious apps. So that's where mobile threat defense works. And the 2 will work in harmony. So the idea is that if the mobile threat defense product detects an issue, it will update the user. 95% of the time, the user will fix the issue themselves, but it will also update the admin in your organization, and it will update the mobility management tool, so that the two can work together to control access to corporate data. And we call this controlled continuous conditional access. Now, the beauty of mobile threat defense is that it will also work very nicely on a personal device. So when it comes to management, you may not be able to manage a personal device, but you can mandate at least that your users deploy mobile threat defense. So that brings me to the end of the talk. As I say, we didn't have too long today, but hopefully that gives you some insights into some of the challenges and some of the things you can do to work more securely. If you'd like any more information, we have plenty on our website at lookout.com, and we look forward to engaging with you in the future. Many, many thanks.